Thank you. I met Sandra about 10 minutes ago before we started the meeting. Uh, I've seen her work, and she does excellent paint restoration. And I will ask Sandra to give you a better understanding of her career while she is presenting about the painting that was conserved of Gaston Pool. I'll talk a little bit about the process of how we acquired the painting. About two and a half years ago, we Wanda Lassiter, our curator, got a call out of the blue from the Pennsylvania Historical Society, and they said that they had a painting that we may be interested in. And she called me and said, was describing the painting. And she said, the little boy is a painting of a small young boy. His name is Gaston Pool. And I thought, well, the Pool family, very important family throughout the state. You have one university president, you have a senator, a North Carolina legislator, a doctor, and most of those are buried in the crypt that's over at the Episcopal Cemetery. I also walked over there before we ever received the painting and found the gravesite for Gaston and his mother. I think her name is Narcissa Sawyer Pool. And I started thinking that at that point, what do we do? Do we take it? They said the painting was in really poor condition. I wanted to describe the condition being ripped canvas. A piece of aluminum had been laminated back in the 60s to the painting, and that it had a lot of lost flaking on the surface. And when you hear of something like that, well, you're in a museum, you can't take that object because you won't be able to exhibit it. We don't want the public to come into the museum and see something that's in poor condition. We like to show the best examples when it's possible, and only when it's not possible, we show the poor condition artifacts. So at that point, we thought, well, yeah, let's bring this painting in and see if we can get some funding to restore it and put it back on display in our it's the federal period in our story gallery, which we call the Canal Period. And so we began to think about how we could raise money, and then our first thought was the Friends, and the Friends did help us with this. But then we thought we'd extend into the public, and so a lot of people that were concerned with the museum's conditions of artifacts or former or were associated with the Pool family thought, well, that would be a good thing to support. At about the same time, our board, the Friends group, with Kim's direction, said, I have a new idea of how we can raise soft money for the museum. And I thought, soft money, that sounds good, soft money. That's a new concept. So we began discussing that too, and that's when the board came up with the Adopt a Artifact program. And it was something that we haven't really vigorously sought in the past. We have had some great donors. We conserved the Gates County quilt. Cynthia Maestro helped with that. It was part of her family. And we thought we've got enough family connection in this museum, we could probably pull this off. After Wanda got through the accessioning committees, we have to go through 3 accessioning committees and before we can approve an artifact. And so this artifact had such great provenance that it was no problem. It went straight through, and Wanda said, we got the painting. And I thought, well, I guess we better get to work. So the next thought was our woman that works with Wanda's name's Carrie Barker. And Carrie began to research painting conservators. And I think at that point, I started to talk to Philip Madry about a painting he had conserved. And he told me about a woman, and he referred to her as Sandy, as in a very casual way. And I said, if she could do something that would suit you, I'm sure it's going to suit the museum because he's very, I don't know what he's very much, but he's a history nut. He loves everything old and likes to preserve things. But tonight we'll have the privilege of bringing Sandra Kelberlow up to talk to us about her journey in preparing the painting. So, Sandra, if you are there, please join me here at the podium and we can get the show started. Thank you.
Thank you. Really briefly, my background, I started becoming interested in art conservation when I was in college. And at the time, I was a science major, and I had a roommate who was an art history major, and I really liked what she was doing better than what I was doing. And so she said, well, you're doing the science, and maybe you should do art conservation. That's kind of a blend of both things. And so I looked into it, and I was like, yes, this is exactly what I want to do. So I ended up going to graduate school for art conservation at Buffalo in New York. And then I did a couple of internships while I was there. One of them was at the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna, and the other at an art museum in Norway. And then for my third year internship, I did a full year at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. After that, I went to Harvard Art Museum for their advanced level internship. And then after that, I was hired back at the MFA in Boston. And I was there for about 6 years. And then after that, we decided to move back to North Carolina. So now I'm back in Raleigh. Excuse me. And a few years ago, I opened up my own paintings conservation studio. So this was a really fun project. So I'm excited that I get to talk about it today. All right. There we go. Okay. All right, so it was a pleasure to have this little boy visiting my studio for about 7 months last year. Now, as a conservator, the first thing I do when I have a new project is to thoroughly examine the painting so that I can gain an understanding of how the painting was made and how it probably looked when the artist first completed the picture. In this case, the artist would have started with a linen canvas covered in a bright white ground or priming layer. He may have primed the linen canvas himself, or it may have been done commercially and then purchased to the desired size. Throughout the 19th century, white priming layers were common, and that's a good thing because they tend to age better than paintings with dark grounds. And the reason is, as oil paint ages, it becomes more translucent. So paintings with bright white grounds are more likely to remain bright or be able to recover their brightness with cleaning or treatment. So then with his prepared canvas, next you would have blocked out the major areas of painting, the sky, the foreground, the architecture, and the figure. The figure was drawn, and he did so confidently because there were no changes in composition that I could detect. The white pigment was lead white, the blue was likely ultramarine, and he used 2 different reds, red madder, which is a light pinkish translucent red, and he used that in the sky and the skin tones, and vermilion, which is a brighter, more orangey red in the coral necklace. A yellow pigment, black, and some earth tones would have rounded out the palette. The painting technique is rather straightforward, solid, and effective, and the final painting would have been bright and bold. Next, it was time to consider the condition and what type or extent of restoration the painting had undergone in the past. And here we can see the front and the back of the painting. So the pool portrait was a deaccession from the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission, in part due to its condition. The curator from the State Museum of Pennsylvania stated, "The condition is of great concern. The Commonwealth Conservation Center condition report states that the painting was wax lined onto canvas and mounted on a 1/4 inch thick aluminum panel. And the painting has a massive system of tears that were realigned and mended when the painting was lined and then adhered to the aluminum backing. The overpainting, tears, and metal backing present enormous conservation costs." Now, the first thing most people noticed when viewing the painting were these white splotches all over the sky and in the dress of the sitter. These are areas of old overpaint or restoration that have aged very differently than the original paint film underneath. When the painting was last restored, probably in the 1960s, the restoration would have matched the underlying original paint layer. But sometimes, especially under poor storage conditions, the restoration can become blanched. And even under the best of conditions, a layer of restoration will eventually become evident because the newer paint will always age differently than the original paint film. So the discolored overpaint gave a good clue about where the old damages were, but upon viewing under ultraviolet light, the damage became much more clear. So UV light is used to see differences in the extent of oxidation of varnish and paint layers on paintings. So generally, the older the varnish or paint, the more brightly it fluoresces. So the dark blue areas that you see all over are where the more recent overpaint is on top of the older original paint layers. So in the UV photo, we can see a clear pattern to the overpaint, and this turned out to correspond to where all the old tears, creases, and damages to the canvas are. And I've drawn them in there on white so you could see where those tears were. The painting was likely in very poor condition and possibly falling off its stretcher when it was brought in for restoration back in the 1960s or 70s. The painting has an aluminum backing, and this was likely done because the painting had so many tears. So during this treatment, the back of the original canvas would first have been adhered to a new canvas with a warm wax resin mixture. We call this process a lining. Wax resin linings were quite common from the 1950s all the way up until the 1980s. After the original canvas was adhered to the new canvas was then adhered to the aluminum backing. This would have given it extra support, and it has definitely kept the painting stable and in plane for what has probably been 50 years since it was done. So while this type of treatment is considered somewhat extreme today, it likely saved this painting from further degradation and maybe even from surviving at all. Sometimes we need to reverse linings if they are failing to keep the painting in plane or if they're failing to prevent paint loss. But in this case, there was no reason to reverse this lining. The painting is stable and there was no flaking, so I left it in place. Now, despite all the tears in the canvas, there we go. The paint film itself was still relatively intact. There was still a lot of paint, original paint hidden under all of that overpaint, and that would become evident upon cleaning, which was a really nice thing to find. So generally, people bring a painting in for conservation when it has structural problems, aesthetic problems, or both. In the case of the pool portrait, the painting structure was stable, but aesthetically, it definitely needed attention. So the treatment would then consist of removing surface dirt, then removing the old varnish layer, and as much of the discolored restoration as possible. After cleaning, the painting would be revarnished, and the losses and stains would be inpainted to match the surrounding original paint layer. So I'm going to take a little detour here and show you another painting thought to be by Unger that I had the pleasure of conserving last year as well. This is a great example of a painting that needed structural work. This painting is of a woman named Margaret Stevenson Lee, and it had both structural and aesthetic issues. Here is the painting, like on the left is the painting in the normal light, and this one on the right is in specular light. So the painting did not have a support. It had clearly been rolled up at some point in the past, and it was actively losing paint. So this would be a painting that needed both conservation, in that I needed to stabilize the painting to prevent further deterioration, and restoration, in that I needed to restore what was missing to bring the painting back to life. When looking at the back of the painting, I could see that there had been water damage at some point, likely soaking one of the stretcher bars, which resulted in water seeping into the canvas over time. So we can see that the water damaged areas on the back correspond to the paint loss on the front. And this is probably why the painting was removed from its stretcher at some point. So this painting would need a new support, but it didn't need to be lined because there were no major tears. I also didn't want to line it, and that is attach another canvas to the back of it, because it had this beautiful canvas stamp on the back that identified where the canvas had been prepared. It turns out the Artist Supply Company, an English company called Rowney and Rowney, is still in business today. I contacted them to ask when they were located at Rathbone Place in London, and they replied that they had had that lease from 1815 to 1858. So it's very likely Unger painted this portrait before 1858, which doesn't necessarily narrow it down a lot, but it's always kind of fun and interesting to find these clues. So for this painting, I attached new tacking margins to the edges and then attached it to a new custom-made wooden stretcher. After the flaking paint was secured with adhesive, the painting was cleaned, the paint losses filled, and then it was varnished and the losses were inpainted. And here's the before and after. Now back to the pool portrait. The pool painting had an overall darkened gray appearance, which was a clear sign to me that there was an old synthetic varnish on the painting. The varnish also had a hazy blue fluorescence, which also indicates a synthetic varnish as opposed to a natural resin. A natural resin varnish will fluoresce green. So both of these paintings originally would have been varnished with a natural resin back in the 19th century, soon after it was painted. These varnishes were usually applied both for protection and to improve saturation. So varnishing was the finishing touch by most artists. Generally, a natural resin varnish will last about 50 to 75 years, depending on its display conditions, before it begins to yellow and degrade. And at that point, it can be removed and replaced with a new coat of varnish. If a natural resin is left in place for too long, it will become dark brown and more difficult to remove. There is evidence on this painting that at some point the painting was partially cleaned of an old natural resin, and the residues from the incomplete cleaning became dark and impossible to remove. So the restorer who did the last restoration had to cover up the residues with more overpaint And we can see that that's what happened in that area of the dress, because there's no damage under there. It's just discolored varnish. So in the 30s and 40s, there were some new synthetic varnishes that were invented, and some conservators started using them in the 50s. The reason was they were attracted to the idea that the synthetic varnishes wouldn't yellow and they would remain easy to remove indefinitely. At least that was the idea. Well, they did not yellow, that's true, but they did darken and they become gray. And some of them have become more difficult to remove than natural resins. So for that reason, many conservators today are mostly going back to using natural resin varnishes. They're beautiful, they're easy to work with, and they age in a very predictable manner. Fortunately, the synthetic varnish on this painting was not difficult to remove. It did require some strong solvents, but it came off fairly easily. So most of the overpaint came off with the varnish as well. And here it is on the left, it's about 1/4 cleaned. If you look at the strip, vertically, and on the right, it's about half cleaned. And as the overpaint was removed, I could see that the paint film was quite intact. There were no big losses, although there was quite a bit of staining around the tears, which was likely glue residue from the tear repairs. And here it is after cleaning. On the left, you can see how it brightened up after cleaning. I also corrected and refined some of the old fills with spackle. So those are the white areas, oops, that you see. After the fills, the painting got a fresh, saturating brush coat of Damar, which is a natural resin varnish. The old varnish residues did become obvious after cleaning. And I could see that they could not be safely removed. So in painting would consist of filling in the paint losses and covering old varnish and glue residues. So in the past, most restorers didn't worry too much about restricting their retouching to the areas of paint loss, which tended to result in the covering up of a lot of original undamaged paint, which is why we call it overpaint. Today, we are more careful to in-paint only the areas of loss and staining in order to show as much of the original painting as possible. This takes more time, more color matching, more consideration of translucency and texture, but the final result is more aesthetically satisfying and more authentic to the artist. We use pigments that are bound in an easily reversible resin rather than oil, and we in-paint over the varnish, which assures that it will come off the next time the painting is cleaned. Having all of our work be easily reversible is important because we know the varnish will yellow or darken over time. And we know our in-painting will need to be replaced in another 50 years or so. The in-painting took about 5 months. The sky proved challenging as there is so much variation in the translucency of the pinks and blues. Different colored stains or fills require different shades of colors or several layers to achieve the right consistency. After the in-painting, the painting received a final light spray coat of varnish to help integrate the in-painting and achieve an overall even surface sheen. And here it is before and after. So as paintings conservators, our first goal when beginning a treatment is to prevent further deterioration by securing loose paint, stabilizing the structure, proper framing, etc. And then we do what we can to return the painting to a state of cohesion. Our goal is not to return the painting to a like-new state, but rather a state where people can enjoy and appreciate the painting without being distracted by its condition. So in conclusion, the treatment of this painting by Ungers was very satisfying, and ultimately I can thank the artist for that. He chose good materials and he applied them in a skillful way, and that is what made the recovery of this painting possible. This painting has been through a lot, yet it was durable enough to survive it all, and it has, in my opinion, come out looking beautiful once again. So thank you, everybody at the Museum of the Albemarle, and thank you for your attention tonight. Thank you.